us to what is subtly the finally that brings us to what is subtly the fourth C, or control. We now just think about the training considerations and how we want to go about modifying or emphasizing or biasing training parameters and the general philosophies that we take into our training and our programming. And we consider how the fascial system works as a functional component to the overall outcome and desire or aspiration of improving speed or improving athletic performance. Given the context of my work and how I am in somewhat of an unusual or different situation than the typical strength and conditioning coach, physical therapist, manual therapist, in that I kind of work in a exclusively one-on-one setting and it's all developed around injury, some of these things can get a little bit lost in translation when I'm speaking to coaches and practitioners who work in team settings or university settings. So with this training considerations piece, I just encourage you that irrespective of what setting you're in, but particularly those of you who are in more of that university and group setting, please just take these into consideration for how they apply to your group and your athletes. These are things that I believe are really just more philosophically or perspective driven than they are practice driven. And I think that it's really just a manifestation of seeing the slightly different anatomy view or mechanical view of movement, and then how that just transpires into the training setting. But with all of that being said, in this, we're going to cover how this is actually conducted, what myofascial based training looks like, how this influences our ability to develop speed, and then some, again, just concepts or constructs that can be applied and when these things can actually be put into action. We start this out by going back to our 10,000-foot view of this and what we discussed in some of the opening modules here. We understand that the body is a system of systems and that the fascial system is just one of those, and it happens to have some significance and some involvement in the outcome of movement and moving fast. And like its anatomy, it's going to be pretty wide-reaching. So we are going to think about the involvement of the fascia from the structural perspective. And as we see outlined in the image, the ipsilateral trunk flexion that we're experiencing during ground contact, mid-stance, and then how that's going to specifically emphasize the lateral line. So again, it's not saying that this is just exclusive to, okay, he's in this position, so we need to train lateral line. We obviously have other things going on. But in particular, in this position or at this time in space, we are going to think about the demand for ipsilateral trunk flexion and emphasizing the lateral line in training. And similarly here, during our transitional phase or after our toe off and in our propulsive phase as well, we're going to see more of a contralateral flexion extension trade-off. So the shapes here being very vivid and very specific. And then we want to think again about how this can translate or correspond in training. Operationally, this is going to probably be mostly focused around our spiral line, which is our major primary fascial line that essentially runs from the back of the cranium and kind of wraps around the body through the serratus and the obliques, carrying over into that opposite hip flexor, and now then coming down this right side of the leg, wrapping back up that same side through the hamstring group, sacrotuberous ligament, and then terminating off in this thoracolumbar junction. So the spiral line is one where those training ramifications are super wide-reaching. So we can organize that and apply it in a number of different ways. On more of the kinematics or kinetic side here, we're thinking about the eccentric force dispersion, how this force, this ground reaction force is being experienced not just at the foot and the lower leg, but then being sequenced up the chain, and then how the body position or the shapes then implicate different structures based on how we are cueing or coaching the technique. We then have our demands for intermuscular coordination, which have been spoken about at length already up until this point, but again, we're in action, we're thinking about just the seamlessness or the efficiency with which the athlete is able to transition from shapes to patterns or creating patterns out of shapes. And again, we've mentioned it, but the elastic recoil effect. So this is where we are thinking about that spring nature to fascial tissue and how it helps to potentiate the musculotendinous network that it is enveloping, and essentially the amount or the acuity or the ability of the athlete to be elastic in these dynamic actions, playing a critical role for the overall outcome. We want to think about everything as within training, we have to be consistent with the speed, shapes, and patterns of sport. I think with our conventional approach, we are very much myopic to the presence of overload and pursuing more and just pure accumulation and volume and seeing that as being progressive or improving the training response for the athlete. I think as we go through the different phases of the athlete life cycle, so to speak, there is a time and a place to emphasize each. But as it applies here, the art or the nuance of myofascial-based training, I would say, is actually just really emphasizing these concepts here, where we are just very driven by what are the athlete's positions, pressures, and then movements in which directions and at what speeds are these occurring are really the primary drivers of training inputs, rather than how do I put more weight on their back squat. Honestly, I think that just good decision making and good training is going to generate overload and progressive improvement over time just as a natural byproduct. But speaking quickly to the specifics of the fascia here, we want to start by thinking about building a robust eccentric capacity. So utilizing that stretch shortening cycle and the stretch reflex is going to be derived from having a good eccentric bank. From there, we want to prioritize velocity over load. So as I've been mentioning, the load aspect of it, this is not to suggest that we are now adverse to loading the athletes, but rather than it being a priority or a focal point, it is simply just a byproduct or an outcome, whereas my priority is going to be more on the movement velocity side of things. I think that the integration over isolation concept speaks for itself at this point. Again, following our shapes and patterns and remembering that the sum of the parts does not equal the whole. So once again, there's a time and a place for isolation, but for the most part, I think that we need to think from the integrative side of things for our athletes. And lastly, the distribution of forces and stressors. So we can interject our biotensegrity concepts here in saying that we want to have good distribution or a good net equilibrium of compression and tension based on what the demands of sport are for this athlete. Utilizing a combination of compressive and tensile forces, I think, is essential. If we think about the nature of holding a fixed object and it being compressive to the body, that does something specific to the joint capsule and the joint structure, which then does something specific to the enveloping epimuscular tissue. Conversely, when we're holding a cable or a band, for instance, that interaction is a pulling nature, so therefore there is more decompression of the joint, which again puts some tensile strain on the epimuscular structures, which then can potentiate the more conventional musculotendinous structures. So I think that's one of many reasons why we want to think about multiple types of resistance for our athletes. Longitudinal and lateralized forces being at least considered equally and then applied appropriately. But again, just shifting back and forth between seeing the body as myotendinous in one nature or in one perspective, and then the other being the myofascial side. And we want to utilize direction and training tempos and positioning and other training parameters to emphasize or bias one or the other no differently than we do so for energy systems development by biasing anaerobic versus aerobic types of conditioning. Finally, the variability, and we'll just tie in the spinal engine concept here. I think that the ultimate trait that we can give our athletes is improving their ability to tolerate variability. At the end of the day, the directionality and the demands of sport are absolutely infinite, and we're going to see every combination of pattern, position, shape, angle, and so on and so forth as we can really imagine. So yes, we have our predominant things and our home bases that we need to continue to work from. However, from there, I think there is a significant value in utilizing the pursuit of variability as a training progression. So this will be more applicable for me in like my block 3 exercises, where for almost everyone in any case, I'm not really necessarily worried about redundancy and overload there. I'm more in this pursuit of variability. The myofascial focus or musculotendinous focus is going to be more of our compressive bilateral patterns and have more of a simple nature to them. That's going to be more of our musculotendinous focus. On the fascial side, we're thinking more unilateral, crossbody, open nature, omnidirectional. And with the openness to the myofascial side, this is also something where we want to try to have a low level of structure or constraint because when we have a high structure and external and constraint, we then have a high external stability. So we're able to essentially create our tension through an external object. On the myofascial or epimuscular side, we want to have an absence of that so that the stability is more intrinsically driven. We've covered it quite significantly at this point, but musculotendinous side, overload, fascial side, organized chaos, we're thinking more in the variability side. And then finally, on the musculotendinous side, where our outcome or our objective is typically to just produce and tolerate forces at certain levels or intensities. On the myofascial side, we're more concerned with or focused on the sequencing and accommodation of forces. So for those of you who are in the team setting, this is something that I think fits really easily and well into, first and foremost, your warm-up and your movement prep. So utilizing a lot of intrinsic foot concepts, and I think there's an equal value for doing things with the hands, so different crawling patterns or different types of grips and multi-challenges for the hands and the wrists is equally important. Utilizing soft tissue releases, manual therapy if it's available to you, and then things like fascia line stretching or just general movement flow are good to fit here. I will make a quick note on vibration, which is something that I work into almost every session with every athlete I'm seeing on the injury side. Vibration is a very potent stimulus for the human body as it relates to the fascial tissue and otherwise. So I think that the application of vibration has a really wide reach. The primary reasons being for that thixotropic effect, where we want to essentially decrease the viscous nature to tissue or give better glide, a little bit more membranous or fluid driven, that allows the muscles and the tendons to function more optimally in their environment. Another area where I think it fits well is that accessory block. So this is where we've done our squat pattern, our pull pattern, we've overloaded, we've sprinted now in this accessory block rather than just selecting things that are designed to improve the numbers on primary lifts. This is where I want to think about how do I just make them a better athlete. So we follow that pursuit of variability. And then more structurally, I think like this, if we wanted to just look at different areas of the year or the athlete calendar, the early off season is the obvious easy one where kind of everyone typically follows more of a fascially driven approach in that sector or time point of the programming. But maybe just even more specifically thinking about it from this lens and then following that shapes and patterns concept for your GPP phase. And I've had some success with this, although it is a small sample size, with this being your in-season model where we are looking at this as almost a preservation or maintenance type of application. Again, we're still going to load. It's going to be, more on that moderate side, but we're still going to load and do so with velocity intent and do so in a number of different ways. But really, we want to just think about trying to optimize or better distribute the stress patterns of the body as they go through their season. Lastly, we can see intangibly, so just generally speaking, again, I go back to, I don't think this is as much of a change in practice as it is in perspective. So intangibly, we can utilize some of these concepts to just help with decision making, evaluating movement in athletes, and then having our decision making from that point. The primary properties with fascia that we're thinking about are the elastic, viscous, and plastic properties, and each of those being governed by the sensory motor nature to fascial tissue. And when we look at these properties as being applied in training, we can come to our commonalities of force multiplication or expression, force dispersion, and then force transmission. So in terms of our training parameters, we're going to look at organizing based off of that. And you can read through these line by line. They are pretty intuitive, but what I wanted to touch on here is how really the elastic and plastic properties are where I end up just diverting my focus to with regards to the training applications and the strength and conditioning side. And I've come to find that the viscous properties and the sensory motor properties tend to fall more on the restoration, therapeutic, or manual therapy side. So in other words, on the training part, we want to focus on fascial tissue that is elastic. It has good spring and bounce. And for this, we're thinking about very fast, short ground contact types of movements, about or under a second. On the plastic properties, this is where we're thinking more about that ipsilateral compression or the lateral line demand during ground strike, and thinking more about the stiffness and the resistance or resiliency to fascia. So this is where we do want to see high effort sprinting and plyos, high force loading, and then really being stiff and strong at terminal range. On this end, this is where we're going to probably get more out of some of our restorative and therapeutic applications, and then also to some of our just general skill and practice type of work as well. Ultimately, the sensory motor concepts govern all of the adaptations and the processes that follow thereafter. So this is something that we really do need to at least have a reasonable understanding of and consideration for within our training setting. And please do not mistake me for a subject matter expert on this. There are plenty of people, to include everyone at Altus, who has spoken at this at great lengths and at much deeper levels than I can. And another individual along those lines is Stephen Jones, who has a tremendously resourceful and informative Instagram page. But with taking this post from him here, this is not typically the first thing that comes to mind when we think about sensory motor concepts. And quite frankly, there's a really poor connotation to this. Sensory motor concepts goes well beyond just balance drills and different types of perturbative or oscillatory stimuli. Although those things do have their place or their application, when we think about sensory motor concepts, we also want to just understand that this is very much in charge of problem solving and different movement parameters, constraints, and tasks that we will experience or encounter in sport. My overarching philosophy has been, if they experience it in sport, we're going to sample it in training. To some extent, without getting into mimicry or recreation, we want to just think about how the athlete is demanded to solve problems and what that bandwidth looks like, and we want to try to have that be at least, again, interspersed within our training setting. As it applies here, and we use this little heuristic in an earlier module, but I see the sensory motor system as translating to our ability to detect creates our opportunity to respond. So if we're talking about being able to be fast, the first part of being fast is being able to detect when you need to go fast and in what directions and when at what speed specifically. So the fascial concept or point here is tying in the proprioceptive acuity in general, but then also the visual and oculomotor receptors that are at work here, and then our interoception or our familiarity or comfort with movement as it's being occurred or executed. All of these things being sensory motor driven, but then also implicating the fascial tissue as well. For training parameters, I think of it as firm barriers navigated loosely. So while I have specific things and clear boundaries to what is or isn't an appropriate thing in training, I don't really have a lot of specific detail underneath of that. Example being, I know for a fact that I don't want to have an athlete who does a split squat where their whole upper thoracic cavity just collapses on them and they fall into that bottom position. But I also don't cue every athlete that they have to keep a perfectly 90-degree vertical front shin and then in this upright position in their trunk and their back knee has to hit here. We're somewhere in between. If we want to drive speed, we also have to think about the instinctual response. So beyond just technical sprint training, which is another thing that you're never going to get good information from me on, turn to the experts for that. But fundamentally and biologically, we can think about speed as it pertains to lifting and movement just as being executed as high velocity actions. So for instincts, we want to think about the threat or the competitiveness or the reactiveness that is, involved with the task at hand. So I can use a good example here with some of the Navy SEAL personnel that I used to work with back at BHP. For them, things like plyometrics and specific dynamic or med ball type of drills were looked at as being a threat because they had this injury that they were coming off of and it's an unfamiliar movement to them. But what that also did was force them to really pay attention and be focused for what they are doing. I think this attunement or alertness of not just awareness of movement cognitively or mentally, but also physically is going to be really a determining factor or a contributing factor at least to improving speed and movement velocity. I then would argue that the variability piece is again at play here, and especially for team-based athletes or sport athletes, the applications and executions of speed are wide-reaching. It's never going to be predictive, and we have to consider that for the sake of how we're organizing and applying our training. And I really just ultimately want to work to improve their ability to tolerate variability, and in this context, doing so at a fast speed or high velocity. As for loading the myofascial line specifically, this can really just be understood as basically as thinking about moving through patterns rather than planes. I think that the three cardinal plane philosophy is really one of the most short-sighted and self-limiting views of training that we can have. We have to open up our perspective on this and really just think that all of the different combinations of things that are experienced in sport now have become fair game for training planes, quote unquote, or patterns in our training setting. With the myofascial lines, it is imperative that we are pressurizing actively through the feet and through the hands as we are training. So this being a good little snapshot of images here, you can see Melvin is barefoot in every session, and he does a really good job of interfacing with the ground, as you can see in the videos, and doing so at a very explosive rate of movement. We've already covered this one quite a bit, but the crossbody, single-sided, unilateral nature to movement is inherent to a myofascial-based approach. In every situation here, we can see split stance, single-sided load, body weight oriented or plyometrically driven. The crossover, the body crossover here, the coiling position being really displayed by Melvin on this one. Back heels off the ground. He's got a good forward leaning posture to him. So it's not that we don't load or we don't do compound movements. We're just sure to do them in positions that seem to reflect more appropriately to what their sport demands are. With elastic based movement, we're going to see a smaller displacement. We're going to see a quicker, shorter amortization phase. And then conversely, on the force side, it'll be a little bit more of a greater displacement and more of a slower but perhaps powerful demonstration of movement. So when we're thinking about trying to specifically load the fascial side, we want to tend to stay more on that elastic type of movement, so a shorter displacement at a faster rate. And that ties right in here where most of our primary loading will be performed between 60 and 80%. And I know the cliche or old adage of trying to stay out of the middle zones for the sake of training intensities. I think when we have a priority on speed, the effort or the arbitrary or applied effort here still goes above 80%, but the physical load just stays in that kind of sub-max range. So to touch on it quickly here, because again, this is another one where Altis has put out tremendous information on this that's better than what you'll get from me, but as it applies to the myofascial lines, I think there's just a very natural pairing between the two. And although to my belief or understanding at least, there was never any real overlapping between the spinal engine being fascial specific or whatnot, again, I think that just intuitively these two concepts overlap really well. So with the spinal engine concept, it really just being this inherent reciprocation and rotary nature to the spinal column, and there being an inherent exchange across all vertebra. From there then being an inextricable relationship between the rib cage and the pelvis. The myofascial lines just overlay very naturally to this, where we are thinking about these cross-body structures and these kind of wrapping patterns of connective tissue. So I think the two really do just play well together. The areas that we're going to identify here, fascially speaking, are going to be the lumbopelvic junction and then the thoracolumbar junction. There's really dense fascial tissue that we'll find in that lumbopelvic junction, and then coming up a little bit higher into that thoracolumbar junction. So those being areas where we want to focus not just on the training side, but also on the restoration side as well. With the training considerations, I think we can just take a step back from the bilateral position. I think that the majority, if not all, of what we need to do should come from that split and single leg stance. If we apply the spinal engine and biotensegrity concepts here, does the bilateral position really make sense? Having one hip in flexion and one hip in extension is how we spend 95% of the time, so I think it should be reflected as such. Position and pressure of the foot is going to be a determining factor for how we are able to utilize or organize this spinal engine pattern. And then this really draws into question, again, similar to the bilateral statements, where how much rigidity and perfect technique do we actually really want to coach and see in the training setting when the ways in which the body are loaded in action are nothing relatable to that. So this is going to create an outcome where I'm still going to utilize my barbell, my ollie lifts, and we'll do our squat patterns, but we're going to do it from a split stance. We'll hex bar deadlift, but from a kickstand position. And then I like to utilize split variations with ollies. So for all intents and purposes, I'm either going to have athletes split snatch or split clean, and then we're going to utilize a split jerk as our overhead variation. In addition, we'll see a lot of landmine, kettlebell, plyos, med balls. all of the things that, again, you would expect, where we want to have that openness and multi-directional nature to movement, doing so under load and with an intent for velocity, and focusing on integrating our patterns and our extremities. The importance of the lower leg and the foot is something that I could have given an entire presentation on in and of itself, but to touch on it here, we think about the dynamics of the lower leg is essentially being ground zero for how the remaining kinetic chain functions and tolerates forces. So the pressurization and the center of pressure, along with the base of support, or where the foot is relative to the center of mass, is going to be a strong influencer for the subsequent firing pattern and rate. Once again, we want to think about this as a means to specifically bias things, or if you are on the injury side, bypass certain things if needed. They should still always relate back to what we see on tape or what we see in sport. From there, with the lower leg, we know that as we work our way further from the midline or the midsection of the body, we see less contractile tissue and more connective tissue the further we go. So the foot and the lower leg is just, by surface area, by design, a highly epimuscular and connective tissue area of the body. So we want to train and treat it as such, and this is going to require a lot of focus on the sensory motor factors, being able to create a good sensory motor acuity or proprioceptive acuity on the base of the foot, being able to disperse the forces across the foot well, having an attuned retinaculum around the ankle joint, and being able to accommodate variability within movement and position, I think are all key. Mechanically, we're thinking about the stiffness primarily, so don't get wrapped up in ankle mobility if you have a high demand for stiffness in your sport. Stiff ankles aren't necessarily an inherently bad thing. It's relative and contextual to what those demands are. But with that being said, we know that as the foot strikes the ground at high velocities, there's going to be a very large amount of ground reaction force, and we want to be able to mechanically accommodate that as best as we can. To bring this to a head here, we talked about it earlier, how we can just broadly, or at least how I broadly organize training as being either myotendinous driven or myofascial driven. So we're either really focusing on compressive longitudinal forces, or we're thinking more about shearing and lateral forces. So on the myotendinous side, it's going to be a lot of closed chain, compression, time under tension. These are going to be predictive and simple movements. We are going to have that pursuit of progressive overload. So this is where we will get our near max and maximal loading. And again, as we've covered, we want to have movements that are going to be high externally stabilized, so that we can just focus on moving that weight and producing as much force as we can. This is all of the opposite. So here, instead of time under tension, we're thinking about time to react and nonlinear, complex type of movements, combination patterns. I know that some people think that combination patterns are doing two things worse at once. I disagree. I think it's really going back to that making patterns of shapes concept, where combination movements are going to help us to transition between movements and utilize things like momentum and displacement. We want to think a much wider range of intensity and load on the bar, and think multiple foot positions, and again, low external stability. So this really falls in naturally as the warm-up movement prep block tends to be more myofascially driven. This tends to be more musculotendinous driven. Block 2 is your wild card, where depending on the athlete archetype, phase of season, etc., this can fall in either. And then block 3 is going to pretty much be mostly myofascially driven, where we want to just focus on variability. And to close this thing out, I think I would challenge the contemporary strength and conditioning coach by asking them to do away with this proverbial "how strong is strong enough" concept. I think this is a conversation where we all come into it with inherent biases, and we just work our way towards our bias and try to convince other people that our definition of strength is right. Rather, I think we need to focus on just that, defining what strength is in our setting for our work and with the athletes that we see. For me, I rely on our archetypes. So it's very common now and almost an expected practice to bucket or be able to have categorization for athletes. So for me, I look to my archetypes and see whichever quadrant they fall in, is that potentially being their strength. So I think with all things being equal, we just want to think about never allowing a strength to become a weakness. So if we have athletes that are more elastic or fascial or speed driven, we don't necessarily want to take that away from them. So we want to think to facilitate their strengths while periodically addressing their weaknesses. And then it's just the opposite case for force-based movers. So the contextual and the pretty numbers and graphs and charts that we all want to produce, while they are great and they serve a fundamental purpose for us, we cannot get so enthralled or wrapped up with them that we just start to put our own priorities and interests as what's best for the athletes. We need to think about diversifying our inputs and think about how we can help the body and the athlete from a multitude of ways, and going beyond just thinking of what we do as either being loading a barbell or running a sprint or doing conditioning until somebody's out of breath to the point they can't stand up straight. So we need to know when to train in and when to train out, as my good friend Andrew Paul with the Oklahoma City Thunder kind of goes off of. And in other words, there's a time and a place to do more musculotendinous based loading, or there's more of a time and a place for more myofascial based loading, and we can flex in and flex out of that. And similarly, as Stu has said a number of times, we need to know when to shove and when to nudge. So in terms of this, bringing this fascial and speed concept back to the fold, we need to think about when we are going to get more value out of this myofascial based style of training with athletes as they go through their maturation phases. Someone who is 22 does not need the same inputs as someone who's 28. Similarly with injury patterns. So there's just I think an openness to this where we want to think about these as being interchangeable and complementary, as opposed to being different constructs or different philosophies that you have to choose one or the other. I think flexibility between everything is really what allows us to be effective at our job. All right, so hopefully you were able to enjoy that and get some good, valuable information out of it. Do remember we also have several practical modules found within this course, so be sure to check those out as well. And then for those of you who may be interested, we did recently just put out a course that is the Fascial Mechanics for Sport. This is a joint project between myself and Matt Aldred, the head of basketball strength and conditioning at Michigan University. And we had several featured guests on this thing. It was a really big project, and it came together really well. So if this is stuff that has piqued your interest, I certainly appreciate you all for tuning into this one. And with that, we would like to extend a coupon code of 25% off. So if you do want to go ahead and purchase that one, be sure to use the coupon FASTFascia at checkout for 25% off.